Section 25 of Discourses, Biological and Geological by Thomas Huxley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Palaeontology and the Doctrine of Evolution continued. But the growth of knowledge in the interval makes me conscious of an omission of considerable moment in that statement, inasmuch as it contains no reference to the bearings of palaeontology upon the theory of the distribution of life, nor takes note of the remarkable manner in which the facts of distribution in present and past times accord with the doctrine of evolution, especially in regard to land animals. That connection between palaeontology and geology in the present distribution of terrestrial animals, which so strikingly impressed Mr. Darwin 30 years ago as to lead him to speak of a law of succession of types, and of the wonderful relationship on the same continent between the dead and the living, has recently received much elucidation from the researches of Gaudry, of Rutemeyer, of Leidy, and of Alphonse Milne Edwards, taken in connection with the earlier labours of our lamented colleague Faulkner, and it has been instructively discussed in the thoughtful and ingenious work of Mr. Andrew Murray on the geographical distribution of mammals. Footnote: the paper on the form and distribution of the land tracts during the secondary and tertiary periods respectively, and on the effect upon animal life which great changes in geographical configuration have probably produced, by Mr. Searles V. Wood, Jr., which was published in the Philosophical Magazine in 1862, was unknown to me when this address was written. It is well worthy of the most careful study. End of footnote. I propose to lay before you, as briefly as I can, the ideas which a long consideration of the subject has given rise in my mind. If the doctrine of evolution is sound, one of its immediate consequences clearly is that the present distribution of life upon the globe is the product of two factors, the one being the distribution which obtained in the immediately preceding epoch, and the other the character and the extent of the changes which have taken place in physical geography between one epoch and the other. Or, to put the matter in another way, the fauna and flora of any given area in any given epoch can consist only of such forms of life as are directly descended from those which constituted the fauna and flora of the same area in the immediately preceding epoch, unless the physical geography, under which I include climatal conditions of the area, has been so altered as to give rise to immigration of living forms from some other area. The evolutionist, therefore, is bound to grapple with the following problem whenever it is clearly put before him. Here are the faunae of the same area during successive epochs. Show good cause for believing either that these faunae have been derived from one another by gradual modification, or that the faunae have reached the area in question by migration from some area in which they have undergone their development. I propose to attempt to deal with this problem so far as it is exemplified by the distribution of the terrestrial vertebrata, and I shall endeavour to show you that it is capable of solution in a sense entirely favourable to the doctrine of evolution. I have elsewhere stated at length the reasons which lead me to recognise 4 primary distributional provinces for the terrestrial vertebrata in the present world, namely, first, the Novozelandian and the New Zealand province; secondly, the Australian province, including Australia, Tasmania, and the Negrito Islands; thirdly, Austro-Columbia, or South America plus North America as far as Mexico; and fourthly, the rest of the world, or Arctogaea, in which province America north of Mexico constitutes one sub-province, Africa south of the Sahara a second, Hindustan a third, and the remainder of the Old World a fourth. Now, the truth which Mr. Darwin perceived and promulgated as the law of the succession of types is that in all these provinces the animals found in Pliocene or later deposits are closely affined to those which now inhabit the same provinces, and that, conversely, the forms characteristic of other provinces are absent. North and South America perhaps present one or two exceptions to the last rule, but they are readily susceptible of explanation. Thus, in Australia, the later tertiary mammals are marsupials, possibly with the exception of the dog and a rodent or two as at present. In Austrocolumbia, the later tertiary fauna exhibits numerous and varied forms of platyrrhine apes, rodents, cats, dogs, stags, edentata, and opossums, but as at present no catarrhine apes, no lemurs, no insectivora, oxen, antelopes, rhinoceroses, nor didelphia other than opossums. And in the widespread Arctogaeal province, the Pliocene and later mammals belong to the same groups as those which now exist in the province. The law of succession of types, therefore, holds good for the present epoch as compared with its predecessor. Does it equally well apply to the Pliocene fauna when we compare it with that of the Miocene epoch? By great good fortune, an extensive mammalian fauna of the latter epoch has now become known in 4 very distant portions of the Arctogaeal province, which do not differ greatly in latitude. Thus, Faulkner and Courtly have made known the fauna of the sub-Himalayas and the Perim Islands, Gaudry that of Attica, many observers that of Central Europe and France, and Leidy that of Nebraska on the eastern flank of the Rocky Mountains. The results are very striking. The total Miocene fauna comprises many genera and species of catarrhine apes, of bats, of insectivora, of Arctogaeal types of rodentia, of proboscidea, of equine, rhinocerotic, and taperine quadrupeds, of cameline, bovine, antelopine, cervine, and traguline ruminants, of pigs and hippopotamuses, of Viveridae and Hyenidae, among other carnivora, with edentata allied to the Arctogaeal Orycterapus and Manus, and not to the Austrocolumbian edentates. The only type present in the Miocene, but absent in the existing fauna of eastern Arctogaea, is that of the Didelphidae, which, however, remains in North America. But it is very remarkable that, while the Miocene fauna of the Arctogaeal province as a whole is of the same character as the existing fauna of the same province as a whole, the component elements of the fauna were differently associated. In the Miocene epoch, North America possessed elephants, horses, rhinoceroses, and a great number and variety of ruminants and pigs, which are absent in the present indigenous fauna. Europe had its apes, elephants, rhinoceroses, tapirs, musk deer, giraffes, hyenas, great cats, edentates, and opossum-like marsupials, which have equally vanished from the present fauna. And in northern India, the African types of hippopotamuses, giraffes, and elephants were mixed up with what are now the Asiatic types of the latter, and with camels and Semnopithecine and Pithecine apes of no less distinctly Asiatic forms. In fact, the Miocene mammalian fauna of Europe and the Himalayan regions contains associated together the types which are at present separately located in the South African and Indian sub-provinces of Arctogaea. Now, there is every reason to believe, on other grounds, that both Hindustan south of the Ganges and Africa south of the Sahara was separated by a wide sea from Europe and North Asia during the Middle and Upper Eocene epochs. Hence it becomes highly probable that the well-known similarities and no less remarkable differences between the present faunae of India and South Africa have arisen in some such fashion as the following. Sometime during the Miocene epoch, possibly when the Himalayan chain was elevated, the bottom of the Nummulitic Sea was upheaved and converted into dry land in the direction of a line extending from Abyssinia to the mouth of the Ganges. By this means, the Deccan on the one hand and South Africa on the other became connected with the Miocene dry land and with one another. The Miocene mammals spread gradually over this intermediate dry land, and if the condition of its eastern and western ends offered as wide contrasts as the valleys of the Ganges and Arabia do now, many forms which made their way into Africa must have been different from those which reached the Deccan, while others might pass into both these sub-provinces. That there was a continuity of dry land between Europe and North America during the Miocene epoch appears to me to be a necessary consequence of the fact that many genera of terrestrial mammals, such as castor, hystrix, elephas, mastodon, equus, hipparion, anchitherium, rhinoceros, cervus, amphision, hyenarctos, and machairodus, are common to the Miocene formations of the two areas, and have as yet been found, except perhaps anchitherium, in no deposit of an earlier age. Whether this connection took place by the east or by the west, or by both sides of the old world, there is at present no certain evidence, and the question is immaterial to the present argument. But as there are good grounds for the belief that the Australian province and the Indian and South African sub-provinces were separated by sea from the rest of Arctogaea before the Miocene epoch, so it has been rendered no less probable by the investigations of Mr. Carrick Moore and Professor Duncan that Austro-Columbia was separated by sea from North America during a large part of the Miocene epoch. It is unfortunate that we have no knowledge of the Miocene mammalian fauna of the Australian and Austro-Columbian provinces, but seeing that not a trace of a Platyrrhine ape, of a Procyanine carnivore, of a characteristically South American rodent, of a sloth, an armadillo, of an anteater, has yet been found in Miocene deposits of Arctogaea, I cannot doubt that they already existed in the Miocene Austro-Columbian province. Nor is it less probable that the characteristic types of Australian mammalia were already developed in that region in Miocene times. But Austro-Columbia presents difficulties from which Australia is free. Camelidae and Tapiridae are now indigenous in South America as they are in Arctogaea, and among the Pliocene Austro-Columbian mammals, the Arctogaeal genera Equus, Mastodon, and Machairodus are numbered. Are these post-Miocene immigrants or pre-Miocene natives? Still more perplexing are the strange and interesting forms Toxodon, Macrauchenia typorium, and a new Anoplotherioid mammal, Homalodotherium, which Dr. Cunningham sent over to me some time ago from Patagonia. I confess I am strongly inclined to surmise that these last, at any rate, are remnants of the population of Austro-Columbia before the Miocene epoch, and were not derived from Arctogaea by way of the north and east. The fact that this immense fauna of Miocene Arctogaea is now fully and richly represented only in India and in South Africa while it is shrunk and depauperized in North Asia, Europe, and North America, becomes at once intelligible if we suppose that India and South Africa had but a scanty mammalian population before the Miocene immigration, while the conditions were highly favourable to the newcomers. It is to be supposed that these new regions offered themselves to the Miocene ungulates as South America and Australia offered themselves to the cattle, sheep, and horses of modern colonists. But after these great areas were thus peopled, came the glacial epoch, during which the excessive cold, to say nothing of depression and ice covering, must have almost depopulated all the northern parts of Arctogaea, destroying all the higher mammalian forms except those which, like the elephant and rhinoceros, could adjust their coats to the altered conditions. Even these must have been driven away from the greater part of the area. Only those Miocene mammals which had passed into Hindustan and into South Africa would escape decimation by such changes in the physical geography of Arctogaea. And when the northern hemisphere passed into its present condition, these lost tribes of the Miocene fauna were hemmed by the Himalayas, the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Arabian deserts within their present boundaries. Now, on the hypothesis of evolution, there is no sort of difficulty in admitting that the differences between the Miocene forms of the mammalian fauna and those which exist at present are the results of gradual modification. And since such differences in distribution as obtain are readily explained by the changes which have taken place in the physical geography of the world since the Miocene epoch, it is clear that the result of the comparison of the Miocene and present faunae is distinctly in favour of evolution. Indeed, I may go further. I may say that the hypothesis of evolution explains the facts of Miocene, Pliocene, and recent distribution, and that no other supposition even pretends to account for them. It is indeed a conceivable supposition that every species of rhinoceros and every species of hyena in the long succession of forms between the Miocene and the present species was separately constructed out of dust or out of nothing by supernatural power. But until I receive distinct evidence of the fact, I refuse to run the risk of insulting any sane man by supposing that he seriously holds such a notion. End of section 25. Section 26 of Discourses, Biological and Geological by Thomas Huxley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Palaeontology and the Doctrine of Evolution. Continued. Let us now take a step further back in time and inquire into the relations between the Miocene fauna and its predecessor of the Upper Eocene formation. Here it is to be regretted that our materials for forming a judgment are nothing to be compared in point of extent or variety with those which are yielded by the Miocene strata. However, what we do know of this Upper Eocene fauna of Europe gives sufficient positive information to enable us to draw some tolerably safe inferences. It has yielded representatives of Insectivora, of Chiroptera, of Rodentia, of Carnivora, of Artiodactyl and Perissodactyl ungulata, and of opossum-like marsupials. No Australian type of marsupial has been discovered in the Upper Eocene strata, nor any edentate mammal. The genera, except perhaps in the case of some of the Insectivora, Chiroptera, and Rodentia, are different from those of the Miocene epoch, but present a remarkable general similarity to the Miocene and recent genera. In several cases, as I have already shown, it has now been clearly made out that the relation between the Eocene and Miocene forms is such that the Eocene form is the less specialised, while its Miocene ally is more so, and the specialisation reaches its maximum in the recent forms of the same type. So far as the Upper Eocene and Miocene mammalian faunae are comparable, their relations are such as in no way to oppose the hypothesis that the older are the progenitors of the more recent forms, while in some cases they distinctly favour that hypothesis. The period in time and the changes in physical geography represented by the nummulitic deposits are undoubtedly very great, while the remains of the Middle Eocene and Older Eocene mammals are comparatively few. The general facies of the Middle Eocene fauna, however, is quite that of the Upper. The Older Eocene pre-nummulitic mammalian fauna contains bats, 2 genera of carnivora, 3 genera of ungulata, probably all perissodactyl, and a didelphid marsupial. All these forms, except perhaps the bat and the opossum, belong to genera which are not known to occur out of the Lower Eocene formation. The Coryphodon appears to have been allied to the Miocene and later tapirs, while Pliolophus, in its skull and dentition, curiously partakes of both artiodactyl and perissodactyl characters. The third trochanter upon its femur and its 3-toed hind foot, however, appear definitely to fix its position in the latter division. There is nothing, then, in what is known of the older Eocene mammals of the Arctogaeal province to forbid the supposition that they stood in an ancestral relation to those of the Calcaire grossier and the gypsum of the Paris basin, and that our present fauna, therefore, is directly derived from that which already existed in Arctogaea at the commencement of the Tertiary period. But if we now cross the frontier between the Cainozoic and the Mesozoic faunae, as they are preserved within the Arctogaeal area, we meet with an astounding change, and what appears to be a complete and unmistakable break in the line of biological continuity. Among the 12 or 14 species of Mammalia which are said to have been found in the Purbecks, not one is a member of the orders Chiroptera, Rodentia, Ungulata, or Carnivora, which are so well represented in the Tertiaries. No Insectivora are certainly known, nor any opossum-like marsupials. Thus there is a vast negative difference between the Cainozoic and the Mesozoic mammalian fauna of Europe. But there is a still more important positive difference, inasmuch as all these Mammalia appear to be marsupials belonging to Australian groups, and thus appertaining to a different distributional province from the Eocene and Miocene marsupials, which are Austro-Columbian. So far as the imperfect materials which exist enable a judgment to be formed, the same law appears to have held good for all the earlier Mesozoic Mammalia. Of the Stonesfield slate mammals, one, Amphitherium, has a definitely Australian character. One, Phascolartherium, may be either Dasyurid or Didelphine. Of a third, Stereognathus, nothing can at present be said. The 2 mammals of the Trias also appear to belong to Australian groups. Everyone is aware of the many curious points of resemblance between the marine fauna of the European Mesozoic rocks and that which now exists in Australia. But if there was this Australian facies about both the terrestrial and the marine faunae of Mesozoic Europe, and if there is this unaccountable and immense break between the fauna of Mesozoic and that of Tertiary Europe, is it not a very obvious suggestion that in the Mesozoic epoch the Australian province included Europe, and that the Arctogeal province was contained within other limits? The Arctogeal province is at present enormous, while the Australian is relatively small. Why should not these proportions have been different during the Mesozoic epoch? Thus I am led to think that by far the simplest and most rational mode of accounting for the great change which took place in the living inhabitants of the European area at the end of the Mesozoic epoch is a supposition that it arose from a vast alteration of the physical geography of the globe, whereby an area long tenanted by Cainozoic forms was brought into such relations with the European area that migration from the one to the other became possible, and took place on a great scale. This supposition relieves us at once from the difficulty in which we were left some time ago by the arguments which I used to demonstrate the necessity of the existence of all the great types of the Eocene epoch in some antecedent period. It is this Mesozoic continent, which may well have lain in the neighbourhood of what are now the shores of the North Pacific Ocean, which I suppose to have been occupied by the Mesozoic monodelphia, and it is in this region that I conceive they must have gone through the long series of changes by which they were specialised into the forms which we refer to different orders. I think it very probable that what is now South America may have received the characteristic elements of its mammalian fauna during the Mesozoic epoch, and there can be little doubt that the general nature of the change which took place at the end of the Mesozoic epoch in Europe was the upheaval of the eastern and northern regions of the Mesozoic sea bottom into a westward extension of the Mesozoic continent, over which the mammalian fauna by which it was already peopled gradually spread. This invasion of the land was prefaced by a previous invasion of the Cretaceous sea by modern forms of mollusca and fish. It is easy to imagine how an analogous change might come about in the existing world. There is at present a great difference between the fauna of the Polynesian islands and that of the west coast of America. The animals which are leaving their spoils in the deposits now forming in these localities are widely different. Hence, if a gradual shifting of the deep sea, which at present bars migration between the easternmost of these islands and America, took place to the westward, while the American side of the sea bottom was gradually upheaved, the palaeontologist of the future would find over the Pacific area exactly such a change as I am supposing to have occurred in the North Atlantic area at the close of the Mesozoic period. An Australian fauna would be found underlying the American fauna, and the transition from the one to the other will be as abrupt as that between the chalk and lower tertiaries, and as the drainage area of the newly formed extension of the American continent gave rise to rivers and lakes, the mammals mired in their mud would differ from those of like deposits on the Australian side, just as the Eocene mammals differ from those of the Purbex. How do similar reasonings apply to the other great change of life, that which took place at the end of the Palaeozoic period? In the Triassic epoch, the distribution of the dry land and of the terrestrial vertebrate life appears to have been generally similar to that which existed in the Mesozoic epoch, so that the Triassic continents and their faunae seem to be related to the Mesozoic lands and their faunae, just as those of the Miocene epoch are related to those of the present day. In fact, as I have recently endeavoured to prove to the Society, there was an arctogeal continent and an arctogeal province of distribution in Triassic times, as there is now, and the Sauropsida and Marsupialia which constituted that fauna were, I doubt not, the progenitors of the Sauropsida and Marsupialia of the whole Mesozoic epoch. Looking at the present terrestrial fauna of Australia, it appears to me to be very probable that it is essentially a remnant of the fauna of the Triassic, or even of an earlier age, in which case Australia must at that time have been in continuity with the arctogeal continent. Footnote: since this address was read, Mr. Krefft has sent us news of the discovery in Australia of a freshwater fish of strangely Palaeozoic aspect, and apparently a ganoid intermediate between Dipterus and Lepidosiren, in square brackets, the now well-known Ceratodus, 1894, end of footnote. But now comes the further inquiry: where was the highly differentiated Sauropsidan fauna of the Trias in Palaeozoic times? The supposition that the Dinosaurian, Crocodilian, Dicynodontian, and Plesiosaurian types were suddenly created at the end of the Permian epoch may be dismissed without further consideration as a monstrous and unwarranted assumption. The supposition that all these types were rapidly differentiated out of Lacertilia in the time represented by the passage from the Palaeozoic to the Mesozoic formation appears to me to be hardly more credible, to say nothing of the indications of the existence of dinosaurian forms in the Permian rocks, which have already been obtained. For my part, I entertain no sort of doubt that the reptiles, birds, and mammals of the Trias are the direct descendants of the reptiles, birds, and mammals which existed in the latter part of the Palaeozoic epoch, but not in any area of the present dry land which has yet been explored by the geologist. This may seem a bold assumption, but it will not appear unwarrantable to those who reflect upon the very small extent of the earth's surface which has hitherto exhibited the remains of the great mammalian fauna of Eocene times. In this respect, the Permian land vertebrate fauna appears to me to be related to the Triassic, much as the Eocene is to the Miocene. Terrestrial reptiles have been found in Permian rocks only in 3 localities, in some spots of France and recently of England, and over a more extensive area in Germany. Who can suppose that the few fossils yet found in these regions give any sufficient representation of the Permian fauna? It may be said that the Carboniferous formations demonstrate the existence of a vast extent of dry land in the present dry land area, and that the supposed terrestrial Palaeozoic vertebrate fauna ought to have left its remains in the coal measures, especially as there is now reason to believe that much of the coal was formed by the accumulation of spores and sporangia on dry land. But if we consider the matter more closely, I think that this apparent objection loses its force. It is clear that during the Carboniferous epoch the vast area of land which is now covered by coal measures must have been undergoing a gradual depression. The dry land thus depressed must therefore have existed as such before the Carboniferous epoch, in other words, in Devonian times, and its terrestrial population may never have been other than such as existed during the Devonian or some previous epoch, although much higher forms may have been developed elsewhere. Again, let me say that I am making no gratuitous assumption of inconceivable changes. It is clear that the enormous area of Polynesia is, on the whole, an area over which depression has taken place to an immense extent. Consequently, a great continent, or assemblage of subcontinental masses of land, must have existed at some former time, and that at a recent period, geologically speaking, in the area of the Pacific. But if that continent had contained mammals, some of them must have remained to tell the tale, and as it is well known that these islands have no indigenous mammalia, it is safe to assume that none existed. Thus, midway between Australia and South America, each of which possesses an abundant and diversified mammalian fauna, a mass of land, which may have been as large as both put together, must have existed without a mammalian inhabitant. Suppose that the shores of this great land were fringed, as those of tropical Australia are now, with belts of mangroves, which would extend landwards on the one side, and be buried beneath littoral deposits on the other side as depression went on, and great beds of mangrove lignite might accumulate over the sinking land. Let upheaval of the whole now take place in such a manner as to bring the emerging land into continuity with the South American or Australian continent, and in the course of time it will be peopled by an extension of the fauna of one of these two regions, just as I imagine the European Permian dry land to have been peopled. I see nothing whatever against the supposition that distributional provinces of terrestrial life existed in the Devonian epoch, inasmuch as M. Barrande has proved that they existed much earlier. I am aware of no reason for doubting that, as regards the grades of terrestrial life contained in them, one of these may have been related to another, as New Zealand is to Australia, or as Australia is to India at the present day. Analogy seems to me to be rather in favour of than against the supposition that, while only ganoid fishes inhabited the fresh waters of our Devonian land, amphibia and reptilia, or even higher forms, may have existed, though we have not yet found them. The earliest Carboniferous amphibia now known, such as Anthracosaurus, are so highly specialised that I can by no means conceive that they have been developed out of Piscine forms in the interval between the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, considerable as that is. And I take refuge in one of two alternatives. Either they existed in our own area during the Devonian epoch, and we have simply not yet found them, or they formed part of the population of some other distributional province of that day, and only entered our area by migration at the end of the Devonian epoch. Whether reptilia and mammalia existed along with them is to me at present a perfectly open question, which is just as likely to receive an affirmative as a negative answer from future inquirers. Let me now gather together the threads of my argumentation into the form of a connected hypothetical view of the manner in which the distribution of living and extinct animals has been brought about. I conceive that the distinct provinces of the distribution of terrestrial life have existed since the earliest period at which that life is recorded, and possibly much earlier. And I suppose with Mr. Darwin that the progress of modification of terrestrial forms is more rapid in areas of elevation than in areas of depression. I take it to be certain that Labyrinthodont amphibia existed in the distributional province which included the dry land depressed during the Carboniferous epoch, and I conceive that in some other distributional provinces of that day, which remained in the condition of stationary or of increasing dry land,
The various types of the terrestrial Sauropsida and of the Mammalia were gradually developing. The Permian epoch marks the commencement of a new movement of upheaval in our area, which attained its maximum in the Triassic epoch, when dry land existed in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, as it does now. Into this great new continental area, the mammals, birds, and reptiles developed during the Palaeozoic epoch spread, and formed the great Triassic Arctogeal province. But at the end of the Triassic period, the movement of depression recommenced in our area, though it was doubtless balanced by elevation elsewhere. Modification and development, checked in the one province, went on in that elsewhere, and the chief forms of mammals, birds, and reptiles as we know them were evolved and peopled the Mesozoic continent. I conceive Australia to have become separated from the continent as early as the end of the Triassic epoch, or not much later. The Mesozoic continent must, I conceive, have lain to the east, about the shores of the North Pacific and Indian Oceans, and I am inclined to believe that it continued along the eastern side of the Pacific area to what is now the province of Austro-Columbia, the characteristic fauna of which is probably a remnant of the population of the latter part of this period. Towards the latter part of the Mesozoic period, the movement of upheaval around the shores of the Atlantic once more recommenced, and was very probably accompanied by a depression around those of the Pacific. The vertebrate fauna elaborated in the Mesozoic continent moved westward and took possession of the new lands, which gradually increased in extent up to, and in some directions after, the Miocene epoch. It is in favour of this hypothesis, I think, that it is consistent with the persistence of a general uniformity in the positions of the great masses of land and water. From the Devonian period, or earlier, to the present day, the four great oceans, Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic, and Antarctic, may have occupied their present positions, and only their coasts and channels of communication have undergone an incessant alteration. And finally, the hypothesis I have put before you requires no supposition that the rate of change in organic life has been either greater or less in ancient times than it is now, nor any assumption, either physical or biological, which has not its justification in analogous phenomena of existing nature. I have now only to discharge the last duty of my office, which is to thank you, not only for the patient attention with which you have listened to me so long to-day, but also for the uniform kindness with which, for the past 2 years, you have rendered my endeavours to perform the important and often laborious functions of your President a pleasure instead of a burden. End of section 26. End of Discourses, Biological and Geological, by Thomas Huxley.